All right, let's dive into the story of Elizabeth Báthory, the infamous Blood Countess.
Oh, yeah, a fascinating one.
You sent me so much stuff, articles, historical accounts, everything.
I tried to give you a good mix.
Today our mission is to figure out the truth.
Yes.
Was she really a serial killer or what?
Well, what's so interesting about this case is it's not just about blood and gore.
Right.
She had immense power and influence.
She did.
And she was living in crazy times, politically and religiously.
Yeah.
That's a very complex story.
Right.
Accusations and power plays.
Right.
Maybe a frame-up.
She was born in 1560
Yeah.
to a super powerful Hungarian noble family.
Like the highest echelons.
Her uncle was the king of Poland.
Wow.
Talk about privilege.
Yeah, that upbringing really shaped her. She got a fantastic education, spoke lots of languages.
Oh, wow.
But there are accounts of childhood seizures
Oh.
and, medical practices back then.
Yeah,
Not what they are today.
definitely not.
Some historians think those early experiences with illness could have really messed her up psychologically.
Okay, so we've got a powerful, well-educated woman,
Right.
but maybe with a bit of a dark past.
Potentially.
She gets married at 15
15.
to Ferenc Nadezhdy,
Yes.
a military man.
A military man.
Led a lavish life, but sources say they spent a lot of time apart.
Yeah. Nadezhdy was often off fighting the Ottomans.
So they weren't really together much.
No, and this is really important to this separation.
How so?
Imagine you're a young, intelligent woman, right?
Okay.
And you're left alone to manage huge estates,
Yeah.
navigate court life,
Right.
and all while rumors are flying about
Oh, rumors.
an illegitimate child conceived before marriage.
Oh, so there's a scandal.
Potentially.
Yeah. Remember, this is the 16th century.
Yes.
Reputation was everything.
Everything.
And especially for a woman.
Absolutely.
Even a hint of impropriety could be used against her.
Oh, yeah, totally weaponized.
So she's both incredibly privileged
Yes.
and incredibly vulnerable. And this becomes really important when we look at the accusations.
Oh, absolutely, a crucial point.
Okay, let's get to the alleged crimes.
Okay.
The sources you sent paint a horrific picture.
It is pretty dark.
Elizabeth is mainly accused of torturing and murdering young women.
Yes.
Servants and girls sent to her for what was basically a finishing school.
Yes.
For noble women.
And the accusations
That's
are
being
beyond disturbing.
unimaginable cruelty, really.
We're talking honey and insects,
Yeah.
ice baths, needles.
It's intense.
Yeah, a stark contrast to that refined image of a noble woman.
Right.
It's the stuff of nightmares.
Yes, but we have to address the elephant in the room.
The bloodbath myth.
The bloodbath.
Elizabeth bathing in the blood of virgins to stay young.
Yeah, it's a powerful image.
It is.
But it didn't appear until a century after her death.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
So it's not true?
It's a classic example of how legends change over time.
Yeah.
Adding to the sensationalism.
Right.
But we have to separate that from the actual facts. So if we put aside the bloodbath myth, what actually started the investigation into Elizabeth Báthory?
It all began with complaints from a Lutheran minister.
Okay.
And remember, this is a time of huge religious tension.
In Europe.
Yes,
Yeah.
the Reformation had split the continent, Catholics and Protestants,
Right.
both vying for power, and Elizabeth herself was Protestant, which could have made her a target.
So there's a religious aspect to this story.
Yes, definitely.
This just keeps getting more layered.
And it gets even more complicated when you look at who was leading the investigation.
Okay, who is that?
Count Georgi Thurzo.
Oh, right.
Now, Thurzo was Catholic,
Okay.
and get this, he was deeply in debt to Elizabeth.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
The guy investigating her owed her money?
A lot of money.
What?
It makes you wonder about his motivations, right?
Totally. Was he really after justice or
Or was this a chance to get rid of a rival and erase his debt?
And that's where this idea of a frame-up comes in.
Exactly.
And it makes you wonder about the evidence they gathered.
How much of it was legit?
Right.
And how much was fabricated or coerced?
They got hundreds of witness statements.
Hundreds.
But many of them were vague or contradictory.
Or based on rumors, which
Yeah.
isn't surprising given the atmosphere.
Of fear.
Fear and suspicion.
You're right. People would have wanted to distance themselves from her.
And maybe even make up stories about her.
Like a historical version of the rumor mill.
Exactly. Whispers and speculation distorting the truth.
But there must have been some credible witnesses, right?
A few who claimed to see cruelty or torture,
Okay.
but even their stories were all over the place. And we can't forget Thurzo's influence.
Right.
He wanted her to look bad.
So he could have pressured people.
Oh, yeah. To make sure their stories fit his version of events.
So maybe a lot of what we know
is just political manipulation.
Like solving a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
And the other half are fake.
And then there are the 4 servants who confessed to helping Elizabeth.
Right, that's often used as evidence against her.
But they were imprisoned and tortured.
Yeah, and probably promised lighter sentences.
If they agreed with the accusations.
Exactly. So their confessions
Could have been completely made up.
we just don't know what they really saw.
Right.
Versus what they were forced to say.
So we've got rumors, vague accounts, and maybe forced confessions.
It's a lot to unpack.
Is there anything in the sources that gives us a motive?
Well, some historians have this theory
Okay.
about Elizabeth's childhood,
Uh-huh.
her seizures, and the brutal treatments back then.
Okay.
They think that constant exposure to blood and violence,
Even in a medical setting.
yeah, it could have made her numb to suffering.
It's a disturbing thought,
It is.
but it could explain a warped sense of right and wrong.
Right. Of course it's just a theory.
Sure. Were there any other theories?
Some sources suggest that Elizabeth's cruelty
Okay.
came from being insecure about aging.
Oh, interesting.
They talk about her obsession with staying young.
Which was expected of women back then.
Absolutely. And the bloodbath myth feeds into that idea.
That she thought bathing in blood would keep her young.
Yes.
Even if we dismiss the literal bloodbaths.
Right.
Could she have been driven by that fear of aging?
Maybe by a need to hold on to power and beauty.
It's possible, right?
Absolutely, especially in a patriarchal society.
Where a woman's value was tied to those things.
This is her youth and beauty.
The pressure must have been intense.
I can't imagine.
So maybe all that anxiety
Combined with her cruelty.
led to those awful acts.
Potentially.
But we also have to consider that she might have been completely innocent.
Of the worst charges, at least.
Right. The possibility of a frame-up.
By those who benefited from her downfall.
The Habsburgs and her sons-in-law.
Exactly. But let's look closer at the political situation back then.
Okay.
The early 1600s in Hungary were wild.
Oh, yeah.
The Ottomans were a threat.
Mhm.
Religious tensions were high.
Right.
And there were power struggles within the nobility.
Sounds chaotic.
It was.
So could Elizabeth have been a scapegoat?
For someone trying to grab power.
Or get rid of a rival?
It's definitely possible she was wealthy and powerful.
Right. A force to be reckoned with.
Exactly. Her enemies might have seen an opportunity
To take her down.
to take her wealth and diminish her family's influence.
Like a game of chess.
Yes,
And Elizabeth was the pawn.
the sacrifice pawn.
But why accuse her of such horrific things?
Why not treason or something? Because it made her a monster,
Nobody would defend her.
even if they suspected something shady.
The brutality of it all shut everyone up.
It was a brutal but effective strategy.
So we've got 2 possible stories.
2 sides to the coin.
A cruel, maybe even crazy noblewoman,
Who lost control
or a carefully planned scheme to get rid of her.
and take everything.
It's hard to know what really happened.
It really is one of history's biggest mysteries.
Okay, so we've laid some groundwork.
We have. It's already pretty twisty.
Now let's get into the investigation itself.
All right.
Hundreds of witnesses, conflicting accounts. It's a mess.
It's a challenge for sure.
How do we even start to make sense of it all?
Well, we have to remember the standards of evidence back then.
In the 17th century.
Yeah, they weren't as strict as today.
Right.
Hearsay was allowed. And, of course,
Power and politics always play a role.
oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So how do we know what to trust?
Exactly what stands out to you in the evidence.
Well, first, there's the sheer number of witness statements.
Hundreds of them.
But a lot of them were vague, contradictory, or just rumors.
That's not surprising, I guess.
No, given the fear and suspicion surrounding the case.
People wanted to protect themselves.
Right. Distance themselves from Elizabeth.
Maybe exaggerate what they knew.
Maybe even make things up.
It's like a historical rumor mill.
Exactly. Whispers and speculation distorting the truth.
But there had to be some real witnesses.
Some who actually saw something. There were a few who claimed to witness cruelty or torture,
Okay.
but even their stories were different.
And we can't rule out coercion.
Or embellishment.
Thurzo wanted to make her look bad.
Right, so he might have pressured people.
To make sure their stories fit his narrative. So how much of what we know is true?
And how much is manipulation?
Like trying to solve a puzzle with fake pieces.
And missing pieces.
And we can't forget about the 4 servants who confessed.
Right, their confessions are often used against her.
But they confessed under torture.
Yeah, they were imprisoned, tortured.
Yeah, and probably promised leniency if they cooperated.
So how reliable are those confessions?
How much can we trust what they said under pressure?
Exactly. We have to be skeptical.
So lots of rumors, vague accounts, and maybe forced confessions.
It's a muddy picture.
Is there anything that explains why she would do these things?
Some historians point to Elizabeth's childhood.
Her seizures?
Yes, and the brutal treatments back then.
Okay.
They suggest all that exposure to blood and violence
Even in a medical context.
might have desensitized her to suffering.
It's possible, I guess.
It's disturbing, but it's one explanation.
Were there any other theories about her motives?
Some sources focus on Elizabeth's appearance.
Oh, okay.
They suggest her cruelty stems from insecurity about aging.
Wanting to stay young,
Exactly. She was obsessed with maintaining her beauty.
which was expected of women back then.
It was, and that ties into the bloodbath myth.
That she bathed in blood to stay young.
Yes.
Even if that's not literally true.
Right.
Could she have been motivated by that fear of aging?
By a need to hold on to her beauty and power,
It makes sense in that society.
where those things defined a woman's worth.
The pressure must have been immense,
So maybe all that pressure and her cruelty,
led to those horrific acts.
it's a possibility.
But we also have to remember she might be totally innocent.
Of the worst crimes, at least.
Right, maybe it was all a setup.
By people who wanted her out of the picture.
The Habsburgs, her sons-in-law.
They had motive.
But let's dig deeper into the politics of that time.
Okay, the early 1600s in Hungary were a mess.
You said it was chaotic.
The Ottomans were pushing and religious tensions were high.
Yeah, and you mentioned the power struggles.
Within the nobility itself, it was a dangerous time.
So Elizabeth could have been a scapegoat.
In all that chaos, someone could have used her.
To gain power or eliminate a rival.
Exactly, she was a threat to some people.
With her wealth and influence.
So they took her down.
By accusing her of these terrible crimes.
It was a way to discredit her completely.
So nobody would help her.
Even if they had doubts.
It was a way to silence any opposition.
A cruel strategy, but an effective one.
So we have two possible stories here.
Two sides to Elizabeth Báthory.
One, a cruel woman driven by her own darkness.
And the other, a victim of a conspiracy.
It's like a historical tug of war.
And we may never know who really won.
Well, we've gone deep into the world of Elizabeth Báthory.
We have all the accusations, the politics, the possibility of a plot.
It's fascinating and disturbing all at the same time.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the dark side of history.
And how easily people in power can abuse that power.
And how truth can be twisted.
It's left me with so many questions.
Like what?
Even if some of the accusations were exaggerated or made up,
Right.
can we really ignore all of them? Was there any truth to them at all?
I think that's the big question that hangs over this case.
Yeah.
We'll probably never know for sure what happened in those castles.
Right.
But even if she wasn't the monster, some people say she was,
Yeah.
there's still evidence that suggests she wasn't exactly a good person either.
Yeah, the stories about her being cruel to servants
Even before the murder accusations.
are pretty convincing.
It seems she was at least capable of hurting people.
People she saw as beneath her.
And that says a lot about how society worked back then.
Nobles had so much power over their servants.
It was a different world.
So even if she wasn't a serial killer,
She was still a product of her time.
a system that allowed for abuse and exploitation.
Right, we can't separate her from that context.
From the power structures that shaped her behavior.
I think that's one of the most important things to remember from all of this.
That it's not just about one person's crimes.
It's about the dangers of unchecked power and how fragile truth can be.
And how history can be used to make someone look like a monster.
Or to clear their name.
It's a warning to be careful about the stories we're told.
To question what we think we know.
And to remember that the past is never as simple as it seems.
Well said. And on a more personal note,
Yeah.
this story makes us think about our own fascination with the dark side of things.
With violence and cruelty.
Yeah. Why are we drawn to these kinds of stories?
What does that say about us? Maybe that's a question for another time.
A whole other deep dive.
But I think we've looked at Elizabeth Báthory's story from all sides.
We've examined the evidence
Considered the different interpretations.
and acknowledged what we don't know.
And that's what makes history so interesting.
It's a constant process of discovery
Trying to piece together the past.
to understand the world better,
And even though we might never know for sure about Elizabeth Báthory,
whether she was guilty or innocent.
just exploring her story has been really eye-opening.
I agree. It's made us think critically.
And realize that history is more than just facts and dates.
It's about people and their stories.
Stories of ambition and betrayal and the mysteries of the human heart. Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one last thought.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about Elizabeth Báthory,
Her alleged crimes.
whether she was a monster or a victim.
Right.
But what about the women who were hurt?
The ones who were tortured and murdered.
Their stories often get forgotten.
In the shadow of the Blood Countess.
It's easy to get caught up in the drama and the mystery.
But we can't forget the real people who suffered.
Their stories matter.
Even if we don't know all the details.
So as we finish our deep dive into Elizabeth Báthory's world,
let's remember the victims.
to honor their memory.
And remember that history is ultimately about people.
And we should approach it with curiosity and compassion. Thanks for joining us on this journey.